Hey guys, imagine waking up every day in a world where your choices feel invisible, where the hum of the communal life is the rhythm you can't escape. The Soviet Union wasn't just about politics or history textbooks. It was about millions of people living, breathing, working, eating, and dreaming under one massive system that shaped every moment of their daily existence. From the break of dawn, life unfolded in a pattern dictated by necessity and scarcity, but also by strange resilience and unexpected warmth. Picture a typical morning in a Khrushchev-era apartment block, the famous Khrushchevka. Small, cramped, but home. Families shared thin walls, peeling wallpaper, and often a single bathroom down the hall. The clatter of neighbors starting their day, boots scraping on concrete floors, pots clanging in kitchens, was a kind of background soundtrack everyone learned to live with. Breakfast wasn't a lavish affair. Black bread, dense and slightly sour, sliced thick. A smear of butter if you were lucky, or maybe a little honey if you had a connection. Tea, boiled strong and poured into chipped cups, was the true morning fuel. No rush for gourmet coffee here. It was a simple, gritty routine designed to keep you going. If you were a child, you might have sneaked a piece of sweetened condensed milk or a small slice of the elusive sausage, products that appeared irregularly in the stores and were often rationed. The Soviet stores, called magazini, were legendary not for variety but for scarcity. Shelves often bore the weight of a single type of canned fish or canned fruit, sometimes expired or with questionable taste, but that was the norm. Queues stretched long outside, especially in winter, when the biting cold wrapped around people waiting for hours just to secure a loaf of bread or some potatoes. This waiting, while frustrating, also became social time. Neighbors exchanged gossip, news, or simple complaints about the state of the world, knitting together the social fabric in subtle ways. Workdays began early. For many, the factory whistle was a signal to switch from home life to labor. Factories were the lifeblood of the Soviet economy, and millions were tied to machines, assembly lines, or fields. The work was grueling, repetitive, sometimes dangerous, but it came with a strange pride, the idea that you were building a future for the entire country. Collective farms, or kolkhozy, demanded relentless effort under harsh conditions, where mechanization was minimal, and people relied on muscle and willpower. Still, there were moments of lightness. Lunch breaks were brief but vital. Workers gathered in canteens, often smelling of boiled cabbage soup and stale bread. The food was plain but filling. Borscht, kasha, a kind of porridge, sometimes a piece of boiled meat if the budget allowed. People talked about plans for the weekend, the latest film at the cinema, or their children's progress at school. Evenings brought their own routines. Television was a rare luxury in many homes, and the few channels available broadcast state-approved content, a mix of news, educational programs, and Soviet cinema that often highlighted heroic workers or inspiring tales of socialist achievement. Families might gather around the tiny black and white TV set, eating whatever snacks were available, sharing stories from the day. Radio was a constant companion, with voices narrating poetry, music, or political speeches filling the background of daily life. For entertainment, people relied on each other and on small pleasures. Card games, chess matches in the park, or reading books from the local library were common ways to escape the monotony. Children played in courtyards, their laughter echoing against the gray concrete blocks, inventing games with whatever toys they had, often homemade or shared communally. On weekends, parks and open-air cinemas became gathering spots, where people sought brief moments of freedom from the routine. What people wore spoke volumes about the system's limitations. Clothing was utilitarian, made to last rather than to impress. Fashion trends from the West trickled in slowly, and were often out of reach for the average citizen. Many patched and mended their clothes, turning every garment into a testimony of endurance. Shoes were repaired multiple times before replacement, and the color palette of daily wear was muted. Shades of gray, brown, and navy dominated the streets. Yet, amid all this scarcity and control, there was a unique sense of community and shared purpose. Neighbors helped each other, whether by lending sugar, watching each other's children, or simply offering a listening ear after a long day. Private life was small but precious. Personal memories, family recipes, and traditions survived beneath the surface of uniformity. This was not a world of freedom as we understand it today, but it was a world rich in texture, complex, challenging, yet undeniably human. The daily Soviet life was a blend of hardship and habit, simplicity and survival, where small acts of kindness and resilience carried the weight of entire generations. The rhythm of Soviet life was inseparable from the seasons, each bringing its own challenges and rituals, shaping what people ate, how they worked, and how they found moments of joy. Winter, long and merciless, coated cities and villages in layers of ice and snow. Heating was scarce and often unreliable, with communal radiators that hissed and creaked, while families huddled around small stoves or shared warmth under thick blankets. Streets, glazed with frost, were crowded with people wrapped in bulky coats and scarves, their breath visible in the freezing air. The cold did not slow down the pulse of everyday life. It only added a layer of urgency and endurance. Food in winter became a testament to preparation and ingenuity. With fresh produce largely unavailable, households relied on root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, cabbage for sauerkraut, and preserved goods from the fall harvest. Dill and parsley, dried or frozen, lent faint aromas to simple soups and stews. The kitchen was a place of quiet creativity, recipes passed down, adapted to the scarcity of ingredients. Porridge was a staple, cooked slowly to provide warmth and energy, while a slice of black bread accompanied every meal, often the only constant on the table. Meat was a rare luxury, usually reserved for celebrations or special occasions, replaced daily by fish, often salted or canned, filling the gap left by ration shortages. Spring was a time of cautious hope, when the earth thawed and city markets gradually blossomed with fresh greens, wild herbs, and the first tender vegetables. People's diets shifted slightly, with salads made from foraged dandelion leaves or garden-grown cucumbers and tomatoes, though these were expensive and limited for most. Gardening, both in communal plots and private balconies, became a cherished practice, offering families a chance to supplement their food and assert a small measure of control over their lives. Housewives and older relatives took pride in their allotments, where radishes, beets, and early cabbages grew alongside flowers, a splash of color against the urban gray. Summer brought its own peculiar joys and hardships. The heat pressed down on concrete blocks and factory smokestacks, and the city buzzed with increased activity. Markets became livelier, bursting with seasonal fruits, apples, berries, cherries, though often in limited quantities and at prices that were still high for many. Barbecue gatherings, or shashlik parties, became communal celebrations when neighbors pooled resources to grill meat over open flames in courtyards or parks. Such moments were a treasured break from everyday monotony, where laughter and stories temporarily dissolved the invisible weight of ideological control. Alongside food, Soviet leisure unfolded in rituals and institutions designed both to entertain and to socialize people within the approved framework. Cinemas were popular, with queues snaking around blocks for the latest domestic film or occasional foreign release. Films typically reinforced Soviet ideals, celebrating collective heroism, the working class, or historical victories. Watching movies was a social experience, a chance to sit in dim halls filled with murmurs and shared reactions. For many, it was the most vivid window into a world beyond the walls of their apartment blocks. Sports and physical culture were highly promoted by the state as essential for building a strong society. People participated in morning calisthenics in schools and workplaces, weekend hikes, and organized games of football or volleyball in communal parks. Children joined youth clubs like the Young Pioneers, which combined recreation with political education, uniforms and badges marking their membership. Summer camps provided a rare escape from urban confinement, filled with songs, nature walks, and lessons about the bright future awaiting the Soviet youth. For adults, dance evenings in community centers, with accordion and balalaika music, offered lighthearted moments of connection. Education itself was an all-encompassing part of daily life. Schools adhered strictly to curricula blending rigorous academics with ideological instruction. Children recited poems glorifying Lenin and Soviet achievements, learned to march in unison, and participated in celebrations of revolutionary holidays. Yet classrooms also offered refuge, a place of friendships, youthful rebellion in small doses, and dreams whispered between pages of textbooks. Books, when available, were precious treasures, with libraries serving as portals to literature, history, and sometimes forbidden knowledge, depending on the censor's whim. Shopping, though a daily chore, was fraught with unpredictability. The shortages of goods meant people developed intricate networks of barter and favors. Some turned to flat, the informal system of connections and influence, to get access to scarce items like soap, chocolate, or fabric. Housewives became adept at stretching ingredients, improvising meals from what the state provided, while sharing recipes and tips in hushed kitchen conversations. Clothes and household items were repaired endlessly, and homemade gifts held greater sentimental value than anything purchased. Despite all hardships, there was a distinct undercurrent of humor and irony in everyday conversations. Jokes about queues, bureaucrats, and shortages circulated quietly, often whispered in tea rooms or passed along in letters. These stories were a way to cope, a subtle resistance that preserved individual spirit amid collective constraints. The Soviet daily life, far from the dramatic headlines or political rhetoric, was a mosaic of small routines, quiet endurance, and moments of unexpected joy. It was a world where people carved out meaning within limitations, weaving a tapestry of survival that spoke of humanity's persistence in even the toughest of conditions. Life inside Soviet apartments was a study in contrasts, both confining and strangely communal, cramped but alive with shared experience. The typical living space was modest, often one or two rooms cramped together in a long, narrow corridor known as the kommunalka, or communal apartment. Entire families might share a single room, while strangers lived side by side, separated only by thin walls and a fragile veil of privacy. Kitchens, bathrooms, and sometimes even balconies were shared among multiple families, creating a living arrangement that demanded tolerance, cooperation, and occasionally tension. Inside these apartments, the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, patterns that had long since lost their color but remained stubbornly clinging to the plaster. Furniture was sparse and utilitarian, often handmade or passed down through generations, marked with years of repairs and patched upholstery. The centerpiece of many rooms was a samovar, a large, ornate metal urn used for boiling water for tea, symbolizing hospitality and ritual amid scarcity. The air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, bread baking in communal ovens, and the faint scent of mothballs used to protect woolen clothes. Families organized their lives around shared routines, with meals being pivotal moments for connection and sustenance. Cooking was an act of creativity within limits, with housewives stretching ingredients to feed hungry mouths. Borscht, a beet soup rich with sour cream when possible, was a staple, alongside cabbage rolls stuffed with rice and whatever meat could be found. Pickled vegetables, a skillful preservation technique, brought bursts of flavor to winter tables. Every scrap was saved, and leftovers often reappeared in new dishes, a testament to resourcefulness born of necessity. Evenings were both a time for rest and quiet socialization. Because space was so limited, many families spent time in the communal corridors or courtyards, where children played while adults exchanged news, stories, and gossip. These shared spaces fostered a sense of neighborhood, a fragile community that softened the rigidity of state control. Neighbors celebrated birthdays and holidays together, pooling scarce food and drink, transforming austerity into modest festivity. Education and ideology permeated all aspects of life, even within the home. Children were encouraged to memorize slogans, sing revolutionary songs, and participate in group activities that reinforced loyalty to the Soviet state. Yet within the walls of these apartments, private conversations often strayed from official narratives. Families whispered their hopes, fears, and small acts of rebellion, dreams of travel beyond the Iron Curtain, stories of relatives lost in wars, or quiet complaints about shortages and bureaucracy. On weekends, communal life extended into the surrounding neighborhoods and parks. Families ventured out to green spaces where picnics with homemade salads and thermoses of tea offered respite from urban monotony. People engaged in simple pleasures, flying kites, playing football, or attending concerts featuring folk music and dances. Public celebrations marked important dates, with parades and fireworks filling city squares, though personal enthusiasm varied widely. For many, these events were a break from routine, a chance to gather and feel part of something larger, even if the ideals behind the celebrations felt distant. Saturdays often meant a trip to the banya, a traditional Russian steam bath, where people washed, socialized, and relaxed in intense heat. The banya was more than hygiene. It was a ritual of cleansing both body and spirit, a shared cultural experience transcending generations. Men and women bathed separately, then came together to sip tea and exchange news, carrying the bonds of community beyond the walls of their apartments. Despite the omnipresence of state surveillance and the threat of repression lurking in the background, people carved out small freedoms in daily life. They cultivated gardens on windowsills, kept pets, often cats or canaries, and preserved family traditions in holidays and cuisine. The Soviet home was a paradox, a place of control and limitation, but also a sanctuary where private memories and human warmth endured. This complex blend of shared hardship, subtle resistance, and communal resilience created the invisible threads that held Soviet society together. Beneath the gray facades and shortages, behind the queues and ration cards, life pulsed with a quiet determination to live, laugh, and hope. Childhood in the Soviet Union was a world all its own. A place where innocence collided with ideology, where play was shaped by propaganda, and where dreams were subtly directed from the first days of school. The life of a Soviet child began in kindergartens, or detsky sad, usually housed in squat buildings near large housing complexes. These early years were filled with structured routines, waking up from afternoon naps in tiny cots lined up in rows, practicing songs and dances for state holidays, and drawing carefully in coloring books that often featured soldiers, tractors, or cosmonauts instead of cartoon characters. Discipline was taught early. Children learned to stand in line, raise their hand to speak, and never question the teacher. Bright red scarves were awarded when a child officially became a young pioneer, an early rite of passage into the ideology of collective pride. The ceremonies were solemn, almost sacred, and the red scarf symbolized not just belonging but duty. Duty to the country, to labor, to the memory of Lenin. It was a kind of civic religion, where loyalty to the state was gently woven into songs, pledges, and even games. School life revolved around rigid structure and subtle indoctrination. Mornings began with the sound of bells and the orderly march of students in pressed uniforms, their backpacks often weighed down by heavy books and packed lunches wrapped in cloth. Classrooms were austere, rows of wooden desks, chalkboards with math problems and patriotic slogans, and the ever-present portraits of Lenin and other Soviet leaders watching from above the blackboard. The curriculum was rigorous, emphasis on math, science, Russian literature, and Soviet history. Everything was framed through the lens of patriotism. Even biology lessons sometimes contained references to Soviet agricultural achievements. Teachers were authority figures, strict, respected, sometimes feared. They demanded discipline, effort, and ideological correctness. A child's success wasn't only about knowledge, but also about behavior, obedience, and political awareness. Students who excelled were often praised publicly. Those who failed to conform were warned quietly, or in some cases, sent to speak with administrators or ideological mentors. But for all the pressure, many students found comfort in the predictability of the system and in the camaraderie of their classmates. Despite the heavy hand of ideology, childhood had its universal joys. Recess was a time of laughter and games. In winter, schoolyards became battlefields of snowball fights, and kids built snow forts or slid down icy paths with makeshift sleds. In summer, break times meant chasing one another around dusty courtyards or trading secret treasures, foreign candy wrappers, colorful marbles, or pencil sharpeners shaped like animals. Every Soviet child had their favorite hiding spot. Their own adventures spun in crumbling stairwells and behind storage sheds. After school, children often attended a cruisehawk, an after-school club focusing on music, dance, chess, or science. These clubs were government-supported and served a dual purpose: nurturing talent and reinforcing ideological themes. A child who loved painting might learn to draw heroic workers. A future engineer would build models of rockets and planes that glorified Soviet industry. Some clubs were more practical: sewing, carpentry, or electrical repairs, helping to raise a generation of self-reliant citizens who could contribute to society from an early age. For those with athletic ability, there were sports schools and physical training programs that could lead to national competitions. Gymnastics, ice skating, and hockey were particularly popular, and young athletes were pushed hard, often with the dream of representing the USSR on the world stage. Sports were not just personal achievements, they were political symbols of Soviet excellence, watched closely by party officials. Entertainment was a limited but cherished part of childhood. Soviet cartoons, like New Pagodi or Cheburashka, played on grainy television sets and captivated millions. Their simple humor and lovable characters offered a brief escape from the seriousness of adult life. Books were devoured by eager readers, tales of adventure, bravery, and exploration, always imbued with lessons about morality, collectivism, and the virtues of hard work. Foreign media was rare and often forbidden, but pirated tapes of Western music or contraband comic books occasionally passed between older children, hidden carefully in school bags or beneath mattresses. Holidays brought magic into even the most routine childhoods. New Year's Eve, not Christmas, was the most beloved celebration, complete with dead Moros, the Soviet version of Santa Claus, and his granddaughter Sneguraka, who handed out gifts at schools and clubs. Trees were decorated with glass ornaments, handmade paper chains, and sometimes small candies. Families gathered for special meals, children performed songs and poems, and state television aired concerts that blended celebration with subtle propaganda. Birthdays were simpler than in the West, but filled with warmth. A child might receive a chocolate bar, a new pair of socks, or, if very lucky, a plastic toy or colorful picture book. Parties were modest, held at home or in a schoolroom. with cake made from scratch and lemonade poured from glass bottles. The joy came not from extravagance, but from the sense of occasion, from feeling seen and celebrated in a world where individuality was not always encouraged. Growing up Soviet was, in many ways, growing up in a world of boundaries, physical, ideological, and cultural. Yet within those boundaries, children found ways to laugh, dream, and hope. They invented their own myths, shared whispered secrets in school hallways, and imagined futures that often stretched far beyond what the system allowed. The Soviet child lived in two worlds at once, one defined by loyalty, rules, and uniformity, the other by imagination, rebellion, and the quiet stirrings of independence. Adolescence in the Soviet Union was a peculiar journey, neither fully free nor entirely confined, suspended between youthful idealism and the heavy weight of a system that demanded conformity. Teenagers were no longer children, but not yet trusted as adults. They were expected to carry the torch of Soviet values with pride, but beneath their red pioneer scarves and neatly pressed uniforms, many were quietly questioning the world around them. At around the age of 14, most Soviet teens graduated from the Young Pioneers into the Komsomol, the all-Union Leninist Young Communist League. Membership wasn't mandatory on paper, but in practice, it was almost essential if one wanted to attend a good university or secure a respectable job. Joining the Komsomol meant pledging loyalty to the state and participating in ideological activities, community work, and public events. Meetings were held regularly in gray-walled rooms under the watchful gaze of Lenin's portrait, where teens listened to lectures about morality, patriotism, and the future of socialism. But even in these structured gatherings, cracks would form. Behind the formal speeches and rehearsed slogans, friendships blossomed. Whispers of Western culture, rock music, jeans, foreign films, drifted in like fog through closed windows. In private, some teens listened to smuggled tapes of the Beatles or Deep Purple, shared stories about life in America gleaned from radio stations like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, carefully tuned in late at night, when parents were asleep and the airwaves were less jammed. It was risky, but the thrill of rebellion, small and quiet, was irresistible. Romance, too, found its way into Soviet adolescence. Public displays of affection were frowned upon, but parks and quiet alleys became sacred places for first kisses and long talks about dreams that dared to go beyond the Iron Curtain. Letters were passed in class, poems scribbled in secret notebooks, and dances held in local clubs became more than just state-sanctioned events. They were windows into desire, emotion, and the messy, unregulated world of the human heart. School during these years remained intense. The pressure to perform well academically was immense. Top students were celebrated, given banners, medals, and public recognition. Those who fell behind were reprimanded or urged to attend vocational training. Every decision, whether to pursue higher education or enter the workforce, was shaped by state planning. University entrance depended not just on grades, but also on political reliability, family background, and sometimes party connections. Children of party officials or those from politically clean families were given preference, while others were quietly filtered out. Yet not all teens dreamed of university. Some chose, or were directed, to technical schools, learning trades like welding, mechanics, or nursing. These schools offered stability, government-assigned jobs after graduation, and a faster route to adult responsibilities. The downside was the narrowness of the path. Once chosen, there was little room for deviation. Freedom of career choice was an illusion carefully wrapped in bureaucratic paperwork and 5-year plans. Jobs were guaranteed, but not always fulfilling. Many Soviet youths ended up working in factories, offices, or on collective farms, where the routine was as rigid as the ideology that underpinned it. A young person's first assignment could be hundreds of kilometers away from their family, in a town they'd never heard of, doing work they had no passion for. Still, most accepted their fate with a mix of resignation and quiet pride. The idea that everyone contributed to something larger, however vague that something was. Growing up in the Soviet Union meant learning to read between the lines, not just in books, but in life itself. It meant decoding the space between what was said and what was meant, mastering the art of doublethink, and walking the fine line between participation and resistance. For teenagers, it was a strange and difficult balance, to believe and to doubt, to obey and to dream, to follow the script while secretly writing their own. Adulthood in the Soviet Union was, for many, the moment when ideals met reality. The slogans of youth, glorious labor, collective pride, and the radiant future, faced the harsh terrain of daily survival, state expectations, and personal limitation. The promise that every citizen would have work, housing, and purpose was indeed delivered, but always with conditions, always through compromise, and often at the cost of personal aspiration. The average Soviet adult's day began early. The alarm clock, mechanical and loud, rang out across tiny apartments just before sunrise. Morning routines were quick, efficient, often shared. In a one-bedroom apartment, 2 or 3 generations lived under one roof, and time was divided with almost military precision. Who used the bathroom first, who boiled water for tea, who ironed their uniform or shined their shoes. Privacy was scarce, and patience a silent virtue. A modest breakfast, black bread with butter, maybe a boiled egg, and sweet tea, was taken quickly before heading out into the gray morning. Most adults walked or took overcrowded trams, buses, or the metro, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the rolling silence of collective commute. Conversations were hushed. Newspapers with headlines praising industrial success or denouncing Western imperialism were folded neatly, read passively, then tucked under the arm as citizens stepped off into their workplace. Work itself was a strange hybrid of seriousness and futility. Factories churned from dawn to dusk, producing goods that were often under quality, overreported, or destined for storage warehouses where they might never be used. The economy was driven by quotas and 5-year plans, not by demand. A factory might produce 10,000 shoes, all in size 39, because that's what the plan said, regardless of what people actually needed. Yet the worker was not just a cog in the machine. He was the face of Soviet strength. Posters in break rooms showed heroic laborers, their sleeves rolled up, their gaze noble, surrounded by hammers, wheat, and stars. Workers were encouraged to overfulfill the plan, and those who did received public praise, medals, better apartments, or even a trip to a Black Sea sanatorium. But most just worked steadily, quietly, aware that ambition could draw attention, and attention, in the wrong way, was dangerous. Offices offered a different kind of monotony. Endless paperwork, meetings with stale tea and overused slogans, and managers quoting Marx with tired conviction. The telephone rang endlessly, but answers were always vague. Decisions were made slowly, and often not at all. Bureaucracy was a language of survival. Knowing how to navigate it, how to phrase a request, when to speak, and when to stay silent, was a vital adult skill. Still, the workplace was also a social hub. Co-workers became companions. Birthdays were celebrated with modest cakes, and homemade wine poured into chipped glasses. Women brought pickled vegetables and sliced sausage wrapped in wax paper. Toasts were made, some official, others heartfelt, and jokes circulated quietly beneath the drone of typewriters or the hum of machinery. The factory floor and office alike became spaces of shared humanity, even as they served the larger apparatus of the state. Housing remained a central concern. While the government did provide apartments, the wait could be years, even decades. Families were crammed into tiny spaces. Two parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all sleeping in shifts or behind curtains drawn across hallways. Walls were thin. Radios, arguments, and lullabies passed freely from room to room. The furniture was functional, sometimes handmade. Decorative items, vases, clocks, embroidered tablecloths were treasured, inherited, or bartered for. Every object told a story, how it was acquired, from whom, under what circumstances. Possessions had meaning not because of their cost, but because of their rarity. Food remained a challenge. Grocery shopping was a constant game of luck and strategy. One never asked, "What do you want to eat?" Instead, it was, "What is available?" A queue on the street signaled something valuable had arrived. Maybe oranges, maybe sausage, maybe toilet paper. People stood in line without even knowing what for, because in the Soviet system, anything was worth queuing for. At home, meals were simple but hearty. Soups, stews, potatoes, boiled meat when available. Home preserves, pickled cucumbers, canned tomatoes, mushroom jars, lined kitchen shelves, made during long summer days, and hoarded for winter survival. Despite the strain, adults found ways to relax. Weekends meant trips to the countryside, called dacha. There, people grew their own vegetables, chopped wood, swam in cold lakes, and breathed freely for a few hours outside the reach of the city. The dacha was a sacred place, not luxurious, often built from scrap and barely held together, but it offered space, silence, and control in a world that allowed so little of either. Holidays were marked with state parades and personal rituals. On May Day, workers marched with banners. On New Year's, they toasted to health, not politics. Orthodox holidays were unofficial but still observed in private, with candles lit in secret and prayers whispered in rooms with drawn curtains. Weddings were grand and chaotic, with vodka flowing, music blasting, and feasts laid out on every surface. Funerals were somber, restrained, often accompanied by a quiet reflection on the life lived, not just of the person, but of the system they had endured. Culture, when it could be found, became lifeblood. Theater tickets were scarce but coveted. A good novel might pass through dozens of hands, each reader writing notes in the margins. Music, even official Soviet compositions, carried deep emotional weight, and those lucky enough to own a record player treated each vinyl disc like gold. Adult life, though constrained, was not without passion. It simply lived below the surface, in glances, in quiet resistance, in laughter shared over dim kitchen tables. The Soviet adult was a master of adaptation, navigating a system that demanded loyalty but rarely rewarded it, fulfilling roles with dignity even when resources were few, and finding joy in small victories. A child's good marks, a surprise delivery of citrus at the store, a sunny afternoon at the dacha. Life was hard, but it was also somehow full. The Soviet Union, by its very structure, was a working man's state, or so the propaganda said. Labor was glorified. The worker was the hero. Factories, mines, and collective farms were not just economic engines, but ideological symbols. Work, in the Soviet worldview, was not merely a way to earn a living. It was a contribution to the collective future, the better world being built one brick, one harvest, one 5-year plan at a time. The typical Soviet citizen worked 5 to 6 days a week. The concept of a standardized weekend didn't fully take hold until the later decades. Earlier, rotating schedules known as the continuous production week meant that not everyone shared common days off. This made it difficult for families and friends to align their time off, but the goal was clear: to keep production moving at all times. The workday began early. Factory whistles or radio announcements signaled the start of the day, often at 7 or 8 a.m. Offices, schools, and institutions opened their doors in unison. People poured into buses and trams, many clutching a slice of black bread or a boiled egg as breakfast, eaten on the move. Some even carried portable stools to sit during long commutes, especially in the large cities, where overcrowded transportation was the norm. For white-collar workers, a job might involve paperwork, management of state resources, or working in research institutes. Blue-collar laborers toiled in steel mills, machine plants, and textile factories, often in harsh conditions. Safety measures were minimal, and protective gear was not always provided. Despite this, there was a deep sense of camaraderie among workers. Teams functioned like families. Birthdays were celebrated with tea and cake in the office, and even the smallest achievements were honored with praise or a certificate pinned to the wall. Lunches were usually taken at workplace canteens, stoladeas, where meals were cheap if basic. A bowl of soup, a cutlet, mashed potatoes, and a compote were common. Everyone ate the same thing, served on metal trays by uniformed women who rarely smiled but worked quickly. Long lines were expected, but so was patience. After work, leisure time was structured but limited. Many Soviets belonged to clubs associated with their workplace, from chess circles to amateur theater troupes. There were also evening courses in languages, sewing, and mechanics. These were often encouraged by the state, not just for personal enrichment, but to build a more skilled and ideologically loyal citizenry. For physical activity, there were gyms, swimming pools, and sports sections. Physical culture, or fiskultura, was promoted heavily. Children and adults alike were encouraged to train, compete, and remain healthy. National sports achievements were sources of pride, and ordinary citizens were expected to emulate athletic ideals. Home life in the evening was quiet. Families gathered around a small black and white TV, if they had one, to watch the news or a state-approved film. Others listened to the radio or read books. Electricity shortages were not uncommon, and candles or kerosene lamps were kept on hand. Nights were spent in shared kitchens, preparing food, chatting with neighbors, or helping children with homework at cramped tables. While Western life revolved around entertainment and consumption, Soviet leisure was often shaped by scarcity and collectivism. Even free time was expected to serve the greater good through education, party involvement, or personal improvement. But within these limits, people still carved out moments of warmth, humor, and quiet pride in their work. In the Soviet Union, much of daily life revolved around work, not just as a means of income, but as a central piece of identity. Everyone worked. Whether you were a factory worker, a school teacher, a nurse, or a librarian, you were expected to contribute to the state. But unlike in capitalist economies, the work environment was shaped not by competition or productivity, but by quota and formality. A common workday started early, with people walking or taking the tram to their assigned workplaces. Factories often opened by 8 a.m., and workers would gather in the cold morning light, wrapped in gray coats, standing in lines to clock in. Offices, schools, and research institutes began around the same time. Each workplace held regular, political minutes. Short gatherings where employees listened to party news, discussed productivity, or praised the latest achievement of the 5-year plan. Most jobs were not overly demanding in terms of pace. There was little incentive to go above and beyond. Wages were fixed, and promotions were more often based on party loyalty or seniority rather than innovation or performance. As a result, many workers developed a rhythm of minimal effort, a system known as doing it slowly, where tasks were drawn out to fill the day. In factories, equipment was often outdated, and safety was sometimes an afterthought. But workers formed tight bonds, relying on one another and finding humor in the shared struggle. In office settings, the atmosphere could be heavy with bureaucracy. stacks of paper, rubber stamps, and strict protocols. Typewriters clicked steadily in government offices, and phones rang with a dull echo across gray-painted rooms. The workday usually ended around 5 or 6 p.m. Many workers went straight home, while others stopped by the store, hoping to catch fresh bread or perhaps a can of fish, if shelves weren't empty. Evening entertainment was modest. Television offered only a few channels, mostly showing Soviet films, news, or cultural programming. Some families gathered around the TV, others read books from the public library, and many sat in the kitchen drinking tea and talking quietly with neighbors or relatives. For young adults, especially students or new workers, social life was organized through Komsomol, the Communist Youth League. They held dances, movie nights, and lectures on Marxist theory. But beneath the surface, there was often a longing for something more. Western music passed quietly from friend to friend on bootleg tapes. Jeans, the ultimate symbol of cool, were rare and cherished. People repurposed old clothes to mimic Western styles, painting on designs or sewing their own patches. The routine of Soviet daily life was steady, predictable, and often monotonous. But within that sameness, people found small joys: a good cup of black tea, a joke shared in the hallway, or a song on the radio that made them dream of something different. It was a life of constraints, but also of quiet endurance. A rhythm of survival, held together by routine, resilience, and the ever-present ticking of the state. Despite the long workdays and a life of limitations, Soviet citizens found ways to build routines and small joys within the rigid system. Leisure time was rare but cherished. Most people didn't have access to foreign travel, but domestic tourism was promoted by the government. Soviet holiday homes, called dachas, were modest cottages located in the countryside. Many city dwellers spent their summers there, tending to small gardens, reading, and enjoying quiet time away from urban noise. Vacations to the Black Sea coast were highly prized. For those lucky enough to receive vouchers through their workplace, trips to Sochi or Crimea offered a chance to swim, sunbathe, and relax. These resorts, though state-run and not luxurious by Western standards, were considered elite experiences by many Soviet citizens. It wasn't uncommon for people to spend years trying to qualify for such a trip. At home, entertainment was modest. Families gathered around black and white televisions, which offered a limited number of state-approved channels. Popular programming included educational shows, historical dramas, and patriotic concerts. Foreign films were heavily censored, but a few made it through the filters, often with altered dialogue or scenes removed. Books were an essential part of Soviet life. The USSR had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, and libraries were abundant and free. Classic literature, especially Russian authors like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pushkin, was deeply respected. Western literature was available in heavily edited form, and readers often passed in censored versions privately, sometimes at personal risk. Board games, chess, and dominoes were widely popular and seen as intellectually stimulating. The game of chess, in particular, became a symbol of Soviet mental superiority. In parks and public squares, it was common to see older men hunched over wooden boards, studying their next move for hours. Children's lives were filled with structure. School days were long and focused heavily on math, science, and ideological education. Uniforms were mandatory, and students regularly took part in group activities such as Young Pioneers, a youth organization that promoted communist values. In addition to learning patriotic songs and slogans, children were encouraged to report on classmates who misbehaved or questioned the system, a practice that sowed deep mistrust. Despite the ideological weight placed on them, many children recall a sense of innocence in their day-to-day lives. Playing outside in the courtyards of concrete apartment blocks, They invented games, made lifelong friends, and found laughter in small things, like waiting for the ice cream cart or exchanging colorful wrappers of imported candy when available. The Soviet citizen was surrounded by contradictions. A culture of surveillance existed alongside a strong sense of community. Material shortages coexisted with rich intellectual traditions. And while the state tried to shape every aspect of daily life, human creativity and resilience often found quiet ways to resist.